Podium Publishing presents The Lady of Crows, a Raven's Shadow novella, written by Anthony Ryan, performed by Stephen Brand. Chapter 1. "You stupid little shit!" Frentis shrank back as Durla advanced on him, though his gaze retained the usual gleam of uncowed defiance. It was one of the things she liked about him, but not today. "If you're going to do something so utterly mad, you could at least have made sure you finished the bastard." He flinched at the cuff she delivered to the top of his head, shrinking further into the corner of the room, a sullen grimace on his lips. "Would have done if his lads hadn't dragged him off so quick," he muttered. "What did you expect them to do? Just bloody stand there?" Durla raised her hand for another blow, this time clenching her fist. "I think he knows he did wrong, Durl," Livera piped up in her soft, sing-song voice. "You do, don't you, Frentis?" Durla's fist hovered as she stared down at him, watching him fail to summon enough contrition to offer more than a brief nod. But for the bright defiance in his eyes, he would have been just another wretched, rag-clad pickpocket infesting the slums of Varenshold. She had always known there was a great well of anger behind those eyes, but had never thought it deep enough to compel him to such an extreme. "My arse he does," Durla said, lowering her fist and turning away. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over the green satin of her bodice as she sought to calm herself. "Huntsill will have the gutters running red for this," she sighed. "And of course you had to come here." "Came over the rooftops," Frentis said. "No one saw me." "He'll know I've fenced your stuff before. Or if he doesn't, one of his lads will. How long do you think it'll be before they're knocking on our door? You can't stay here." "Durl," Livera came to her side, dusky hands reaching for hers. "The boy's got nowhere else." She leaned close, smelling of jasmine and honeysuckle, Durla's favourite. She knew Livera would have dabbed on a spot or two upon hearing her ascend the stairs to their rooms. "And he's always done right by us," Livera said. "Never lost money on the stuff he brought us, for which he was paid a fair price." Durla felt her resolve erode a little as Livera pressed her violet-painted lips to her neck, letting the kiss linger. "He's a good boy," Livera whispered, raising her lips to hover over Durla's ear. "Reminds me of my brother." "You're dead, brother," Durla said, putting an edge on her tone that made Livera step back, her small oval face bunching with hurt. Durla's resolve almost faded completely, but she clamped it in place, pulling her hands free of Livera's and turning back to Frentis. "One of us has to do the hard things." "You need to get out of Varenshold," she told the boy flatly, moving to the mantel above the fireplace. She opened the small chest sitting below the gilt-framed mirror and extracted half a dozen silvers. "Get yourself to the docks," she said, holding the coins out to Frentis. "Find a ship called the Sojourner. The boatswain's got certain habits." A frown creased Frentis's besmirched brow as he stared up at her. "Habits? Kind of habits that'll let a boy earn his passage across the Iranian." She jangled the coins in her palm. "But he'll still expect a little something up front." "Fuck that," Frentis began, lips forming a sneer. "You think you've got any other options?" Durla grabbed the scruff of the boy's rags and dragged him upright so that he stood on tiptoe. "You stuck a throwing knife in the eye of the worst shit this city has to offer. What do you think would happen next? A nice frolic through the flower beds? I ain't selling my arse to no sailor. Not everybody wants to be a whore." There was no holding her fist this time. It caught him a hard blow on the side of the head, sending him sprawling and provoking a sob from Livera. "Durl!" she scolded her, rushing to the boy's side. Durla ignored Livera's reproachful scowl as she helped Frentis up, putting a protective arm around him and smoothing a hand over the knot of greasy hair left by Durla's fist. His eyes, she noted, remained as bright and defiant as ever. "You don't want my help? Fine," she told him, returning the silvers to the chest and closing the lid with a hard snap. "Feel free to take your troublesome arse elsewhere. Piss off to the Sixth Order, why don't you? Since you're such great friends with the Battle Lord's whelp and all." "Never said he was my friend," Frentis retorted. "Just that he gave you a knife the day he beat the merry shit out of a bunch of guardsmen at the Summertide Fair. I know." Durla gripped the mantelpiece, frowning as she sought to control an anger laced with no small amount of fear. "Come to think on it, it's not that bad a notion," she said after a moment's contemplation. "Hunsill won't think of it, not right off anyway, you being an orphan with no one to give you over to them." "He can't go there," Livera said, holding Frentis closer. "Boys die there. What do you think he'll be doing tomorrow if he doesn't?" Durla watched Frentis's face as the notion took hold, a small flicker of determination passing across his brow. "Why would they take me?" he asked. "Some gutter-born dipper with no family to put him in the faith's hands." "Doesn't have to be family. Just someone who can vouch for you. Who better than your knife-gifting friend?" Frentis briefly clasped Livera's hand, then disentangled himself from her, getting to his feet and moving to stand in front of Durla. "That hurt," he said, rubbing his head. "It was supposed to, you mouthy little sod." She glanced at the window, seeing the lengthening shadows stretch over the tangle of chimney and slate. "You can stay till it gets dark. Don't use the rooftops. Hunsell's boys will be watching them by now. There's a passage through the cellars to the sewers. I suppose you still know the way to the drains that feed into the brine wash." "Course," he said with an aggrieved pout. "Good. You'll have to swim for it. Stay clear of the bridges. Once you're out, stay off the road. If you're not at the order house by morning, I will be." He paused, a small grin of gratitude playing over his lips. "They'll still come looking," he said. "Hunsell's lads." "Yes, they will. Liv, fix this boy some soup. No point sending him off to the Sixth Order with an empty belly." Chapter 2. Hunsell sent Ratter and Draker, which Durla would normally have considered something of an insult, but assumed his more reliable employees were otherwise engaged just now. "Too much to expect you to wipe your feet, I see," she greeted them, casting a caustic eye at the mud Ratter's boots had left on her fine Alpiran carpet. Ratter began to respond with a sheepish shrug, then stopped himself, fixing an unrepentant glare on his narrow, pointy-nosed face instead. Draker was apparently too preoccupied with ogling Livera to respond at all, so much so that Ratter felt obliged to deliver a hard shove to the side of his companion's shaggy-haired head. "Wake up, lackwit! We're here on business, remember?" "Not that you could afford either of us," Livera said, not looking up from her embroidery. She sat by the window, working a needle and thread through a circle of framed silk. Her pleated skirt was long enough to conceal the daggers she had strapped to both legs. Durla's own knife was tucked into a hidden sheath at the small of her back, a curved fisherman's gutting blade used for swiftly laying open a belly or a throat in a confined space. "Watch your lip," Ratter said, making an effort to sound menacing. However, his threatening tone was undermined somewhat as he gave a short backward step, removing his muddy boots from the carpet. Durla had always thought him too wary a character to make a successful thug, but today his habitual nervousness had blossomed into outright fear. Fear is bad, she knew. Fear makes even a coward dangerous. "State your business or piss off," she advised, her tone one of weary disdain. "We have appointments to keep." "Frentis," Ratter said. "Where is he?" "How should I know? You fence for him. Everyone knows that. I fence for half the dippers in this city. Doesn't mean I know where they are at any given moment." She angled her head in a display of calculation. "But that also doesn't mean I can't find him. If I'm adequately compensated for my time and trouble, of course. What's he done, anyway?" "You been asleep all day or something?" Ratter asked. "The whole quarter's in uproar." "We had a late night," Livera said, raising her head to smile at Durla. "Didn't do much sleeping, did we, Durl?" "What's that?" Draker said, voice husky with lust as he took an involuntary step forward. Durla could smell the cheap grog matting his beard. "Business," Ratter reminded Draker, applying another hard shove to his head. This time the larger man responded with a growl, rounding on his diminutive companion and crouching in readiness for a lunge. "You two fuckheads want to fight? Do it outside," Durla said. The pair glared at each other for a second before slowly turning back to her, Draker's bearded face displaying a sulky frown, though his eyes inevitably began to stray to Livera once again. "Hunsell lost an eye last night," Ratter said. "Frentis is doing." "That scrawny whelp?" Durla scoffed. "Come off it." We was there, Ratter insisted. He sank a throwing knife into Hunsel's eye from 15 feet away, then went skipping off across the rooftops. I've seen less tidy jobs from lifelong cutthroats. Tidier still if you'd actually finished it, Durla thought, putting the appropriate measure of surprise on her face as Ratter continued. So, you see, he said, Hunsel won't want to hear any shit about adequate compensations and such. In fact, we tell him you weren't generous with your help, he's going to send us back with different orders. Durla said nothing, watching the increasingly bright sheen of sweat form on Ratter's balding pate. You were there? She said. Supposed to be guarding him, right? Didn't do a very good job, did you? Expect he's awful riled about that. Seems to me he's likely to be angrier at you two than me right now. Just tell us where he is, Durla. Ratter started forward, teeth bared in a snarl of impending violence, as Draker followed his lead, dropping into a preparatory crouch. Durla saw Livera tense, hands stopping their work to settle into her lap and grip her skirts. Durla resisted the impulse to reach for her knife, instead arching a tired eyebrow at the two visitors and asking, Is that really the best idea? There were times when a reputation born of excessive violence had its advantages. Durla's had been won after a brief but spectacularly bloody encounter with a Valerian sea captain. Having employed her services for the better part of a week, the fellow then avowed a disinclination to settle his bill, employing an unwise level of incivility in the process. Although Durla hadn't been able to extract the required funds, she took some comfort from the knowledge that the man would have great difficulty voicing such language in future, she having shortened his tongue by 2 inches. Draker bridled at her words, but Ratter, the smarter of the two by a small margin, reached out a hand to restrain him. If you won't talk to us, he'll send others who ain't so nice, he said, in a rare display of honesty. Durla gave him an annoyed sigh and turned to Livera. You knew the little bastard best, Liv. Where's he likely to be? He knows the sewers better than anyone, Livera replied, smiling sweetly at Ratter. Even you. They've already been scoured from end to end, he said. Has to be somewhere else. He was always going on about getting enough loot together to buy a berth on a ship one day. Going to sail away from this pit for good, he said. The docks have been scoured too. Is the Sojourner still at anchor? Durla asked before going on to elaborate on the boatswain's proclivities. Any berth will do if a boy's desperate enough, she added with an explanatory shrug. In fact, she had made a surreptitious trip to the docks at first light to ensure the Sojourner had sailed with the morning tide. By good fortune, the vessel was destined for the far west, which meant she wouldn't return to Varinsholt for at least a year. We'll check on it, Ratter said, shoving Draker towards the door. The larger man stayed put, his gaze lingering on Livera once more. I got some coin, he began, reaching for a purse on his belt. There's not enough gold or liquor in the world, Durla told him, then jerked her head at the door. Draker's face darkened, but he duly shuffled after Ratter as he stepped out onto the landing. If I were you, Durla added, I wouldn't stick around too long. Once Hunsel's scraped this city clean looking for Frentis, he'll need to sate his anger on someone. I hear there's profit to be had on the southern shore if you don't mind getting your feet wet. Ratter met her gaze for an instant, giving a faint nod of grim acceptance before closing the door. That could have gone worse, Livera said quietly once the footsteps had faded from the staircase. Durla went to the window, watching the pair of miscreants make their way along Lofter's Walk in the direction of the docks. With any luck, she said, they'll linger long enough to tell Hunsel the ship's already sailed and flee the city as soon as they can. Doesn't mean he won't send someone else. No, Durla admitted, sinking down next to Livera and taking her hand. Best if we stay quiet for a while. No more fencing Dipper's loot until this dies down. No appointments for the next few weeks. Also, keep a bag packed in case we have to run. But Quo's got another client lined up, Livera said with an aggrieved pout, an ill-sailing merchant who just bought a royal warrant to trade in Varinsholt. She rested her head on Durla's shoulder, brows raised and eyes wide in kittenish solicitation. Merchants always know so much, she purred. And think of all that loot his ships will be bringing in. Silks and porcelain, Quo said. He's a big fish, Durl. Be a shame not to land him. And Hunsel's likely to pay well for knowledge like that. Make him less peeved, baby. I sometimes think I taught you too well, Durla muttered. When? Next Oprian. Is this merchant a civilized sort, or another of Quo Shah's deviants? Livera's slim shoulders moved in a shrug. A man of simple tastes, apparently. Easily pleased. All right. Durla squeezed her hand. But I'll hire Gallus to keep tabs, just in case this fellow's not so simple. And make sure to take your knife. Chapter 3. Durla spent Oprian evening at her studies. Aspect Dendrish's Rise of the Merchant Kings had been recommended to her by one of her clients, a master of histories from the Third Order, who agreed to provide tutelage in return for a reduced hourly rate. After wading through 100 pages of overblown prose, long on narrative and short on analysis, Durla concluded her client had been somewhat biased in his opinion of his Aspect's work. Still, the volume contained some useful statistical tables on the growth of far western trade since the days of the Red Hand, which she spent a contented hour or two transcribing into her own notes. Besides Livera, economics had been Durla's principal passion for the past several years, and their rooms were increasingly filled with her reference library. It was all greatly amusing for Livera. "What use does a whore have for all these words and numbers?" she had asked shortly after moving in. "The mind stays healthy longer than the body," Durla told her, "and I've got no intention of living out my elder years in penury." She became so engrossed in her transcription that she failed to notice the hour until the faint tolling of the midnight bell beyond the window. Whilst their shared occupation invariably involved late hours, Livera was usually capable of satisfying her clients and returning home well before the bell. Durla returned to her work for a spell, but soon found herself pacing the room, nerves fraying with every prolonged second. After an hour in which Livera had signally failed to reappear, Durla strapped a knife around her waist, pulled on her cloak, and went out into the street. She tried the Red Anchor first, a small but orderly drinking hole she knew Gallus favoured for a nightcap or two, on the rare occasions he had money in his pocket. She found it only half full of patrons, too insensible to even make the effort of a catcall. There was no sign of Gallus, and the barkeep denied seeing him all night. "Probably off climbing some rich bugger's wall," he said, with a shrug, before leaning closer and adding, "Don't suppose you're working tonight, Durl? Been awful dull in the evening since One Eye went on the rampage." One Eye. She supposed the name was inevitable. In the days since Frentis's disappearance, Hunsel had embarked on the kind of purge not seen in the Varansold underworld for years. Rumour had it well over a dozen bodies had been consigned to the depths of the harbour, most of them slain by Hunsel himself, who made a point of wielding the knife in front of the victim's kin. It was also rumoured that he forced them to look into his empty eye socket at the final moment, commanding that they cough up any knowledge of Frentis, as the ghost of his eye now had the power to see lies. Such was the fear engendered by One Eye's rampage that criminal activity had died down to almost nothing. Whores and thieves stayed home, and went hungry rather than attract the notice of their new king, which is what Hunsel's purge had made him now. Durla ignored the barkeep's offer and slid a couple of coppers across the bar. "Gallus shows up?" "Send someone to tell me," she said before turning and walking out. Gallus kept an attic above a tanner's shop on Skinner's Row. Rents were cheap here due to the smell, and Durla was obliged to shield her nose with a scented handkerchief as she pounded on the tanner's door. "Ain't been back all day," the bleary-eyed and evidently peeved proprietor reported, "and I got no time for pestering doxies." He was an old man and lacked the strength to push the door closed as Durla stepped forward to brace her shoulder against it. "And I'm in no mood to suffer insult, you old fuck," she informed him quietly, bringing her knife up, quick and neat, pressing the tip of the blade to his nose. "Gallus comes back, tell him Durla's looking, and he better not delay in finding me." She kept the knife pressed into the warty mass of the tanner's nose until he gave a very slow nod. She spent another fruitless hour touring any haunt where Gallus or Livera might have gone, finding nothing. Eventually she forced herself to turn for home as the first glimmerings of dawn broke over the rooftops. Upon rounding the corner into Lofter's Walk, she came to an abrupt halt. Little Dot waited on her doorstep. Although a woman of nearly 20 years, Dot stood a hair over 3 feet tall. Her miniature features, usually so bright and cheerful, were set in a mask of grim sympathy. "My sister sent me," she said, as Durla forced herself to take a forward step, a hard ball of dread forming in her stomach. Dot's sister, Big Dot, was both healer and mortician for much of the Varensold criminal fraternity. Durla managed a few more steps before coming to a halt, taking a second to steady her suddenly dizzy head as she stood staring down at little Dot. The small woman clasped her hands together, blinking tears. She had always liked Livera, but then so did everyone. "She dead?" Durla asked, surprised by the calm she heard in her own voice. "I'm so sorry, Durl." "Gallus?" "Bashed up, but still breathing." Dot stepped forward, reaching out to take Durla's hand. "Come on," she said, and Durla allowed herself to be tugged along in numb silence. "Arrangements need to be made." Chapter 4. Big Dot was a markedly less sensitive disposition than her sister, standing with her meaty arms crossed over her chest and heavy-jawed features impassive as Durla looked down at Livera's body. It was, Durla knew, the accustomed detachment of the veteran physician, learned thanks to years of watching grieving souls weep over murdered kin or lovers. But Durla didn't weep. Dot had cleaned Livera's corpse, wiping the blood from her skin and washing it from her dark curls. She had also dressed her in a plain cotton shift before laying her out on the table in her vault-like cellar that served as a mortuary. A cloth was draped over Livera's neck, presumably to spare Durla the sight of the bruising. Big Dot had also sewn Livera's lips together with near-invisible catgut stitches to remove the death grimace. Durla felt a small flutter of gratitude for this, but it faded almost as soon as it rose in her breast. "We both died tonight," she decided, eyes tracking over Livera's empty form. She felt no inclination to touch her, feel the cold, lifeless chill of her skin. She's not there anymore. "How many times?" she asked Big Dot, raising her gaze from the corpse. The woman took a moment to reply, heavy brows creasing a little. Clearly it wasn't a typical question. "Times? You said she was strangled, then stabbed. How many times?" Big Dot blinked and exchanged a glance with her sister, who sat perched on a stool by the door. "Just tell her, Dot," Little Dot said softly. "Counted 50 wounds altogether," Big Dot said, adopting a brisk professional tone. "All in the chest and stomach." "Was she raped?" More blinking, another glance at her sister. "There was damage to her nethers," Big Dot said finally. "Lack of blood means it happened after death." "Strangled her, stabbed her, then fucked her corpse," Durla mused. "Man who does that doesn't just do it once." "Haven't seen one like this before," Big Dot said. "Been years since the hacker was about, and we settled with him right and proper." Durla remembered the hacker well. A deserter from the Realm Guard, some said had been driven mad by one battle too many. He'd hidden himself in the southern quarter and embarked upon a month-long rampage that left every whore in the city fearful of venturing out in the darkness. The madman had eventually been cornered by a mob near the docks, who, after a thorough beating, handed him over to a select group of aggrieved ladies. Durla still recalled the fellow's screams, and they didn't trouble her sleep one whit. "I'd wager there'd have been others like this in Nilsel," she told Big Dot. "Where was she found?" "The backyard of the Black Boar," Little Dot said. "Hunsil's place," Durla thought, "where no one will be surprised to find another body come the morning." It was a decent enough ruse, but she saw through it instantly. One Eye had no need to trouble himself with such an elaborate trap when all he had to do was send his lads to break down their door in the small hours of the morning. She allowed herself a final look at Livera's face, seeing only a flaccid, bleached facsimile of the woman she loved. "Where's Gallus?" she said, turning away. "Down the hall," Little Dot said, hopping down from her stool. "I'll show you." "Durla," Big Dot said, making her pause at the door. "What do you want done?" she asked, gesturing at the corpse. "I know a discreet brother from the Second Order who'd be willing to say the words and give her to the fire." "She held to the Alpiran gods," Durla said. "They entomb their dead. Find somewhere deep and hidden for her. I'll take care of any expense." Gallus perched his muscular form on the edge of the bed, arms resting on his knees and his head slumped forward. Big Dot had shaved his normally thick black hair down to the scalp to get at the 3 cuts on his head. They were small but deep, the stitches dark, spidery clusters amidst the grey stubble. Durla knew the pattern well enough. 3 rapid blows from a kosh, more than one attacker. "Can you talk?" she asked him. Gallus's head slumped lower still at the sound of her voice, his long-fingered climber's hands bunching into fists. "Yeah," he said in a gruff mutter, the voice possessing a tension that told of lingering pain. "I think another dose is in order," Little Dot said, moving to the earthenware jug and cup on a nearby table. She poured a measure of dark liquid into the cup and held it out to Gallus. It was, Durla knew, one of her more potent pain remedies, red flour infused with various herbs to alleviate the soporific effect. Big Dot set the bones and stitched the cuts, whilst Little Dot mixed the medicine, much of it more efficacious than anything the Fifth Order could provide. "Don't want it," Gallus said, waving her away. "It'll clear your head," Dot insisted, reaching out to clasp one of his hands, which he snatched away. "Just drink it," Durla told him. "You're no use to me with an addled brain." Gallus looked up at her for the first time, red, moist eyes shining with what Durla discerned to be guilt rather than fear. After a second he blinked and took the cup from Dot, downing the contents in hard, punishing gulps that left him retching. "Leave us for a bit, would you, Dot?" Durla said. She waited for the healer to leave, then closed the door behind her, turning back to Gallus. He continued to cough for a few moments, then gave a heavy sigh, darting a look at Durla. "You want blood? You can have it," he said. "Not yours," she replied, moving to sit on the small stool next to the bed. "I messed up, Durl," Gallus went on, still avoiding her gaze. "Didn't do what you paid me for." Durla slapped him, the blow swift and hard, leaving a red patch on his cheek and bringing some life back to his eyes. "We have work to do," she said. "When it's done, go and chuck yourself in the brine wash for all I care. Until then, you owe me a debt, and I expect payment. Understand?" He met her gaze, holding it this time. "Whatever you need. I need you to tell me what happened." "Got jumped is what happened. Picked up Livera as promised and escorted her to the place Quo Shah said, rooms above the old pottery on Rattler's Lane. Client wanted discretion, Livera said. They jumped us at the corner, 3 of them, and they knew what they were doing. I fought, Durl. I did. Managed to get my knife in my hand, pretty sure I scarred one good on the face, but—" His hand went to the stitched scars on his scalp. 3 to 1 is bad odds. I didn't come to until the small hours, and she was gone. I looked, but— He trailed off, letting his gaze drop. "You scarred one on the face?" Durla said. "Did you get a good look?" "They wore scarves. Caught a glimpse of the one I cut, though. He'd be hard to miss. Got him from ear to ear." Gallus traced a finger from the bridge of the nose down to his chin. Durla sat in silence for a time, mind churning over the various possibilities, though it was an effort to prevent it straying back to the sight of Livera's empty, stitch-mouthed face. Ambushed before they got to the place. Means the client was waiting somewhere else. "We need a crew," she said, getting to her feet. "Reliable folk who don't balk at the wet stuff." "Hiring help ain't too easy just now," Gallus said. "One eye's calmed down a bit, but not much. Offer 2 golds each for a few nights' work. Double it to 4 if you have to." Gallus's brow creased in a doubtful frown. "I know you do well for yourself, Durl, but that's a lot of coin." "Coin can't be spent by a dead woman." "Vouch for me," she said. "Make sure they know I'm good for it." She moved to the door. "Bring them to my place tonight. We have a call to make on Quo Shah." Chapter 5. Quo Shah claimed to be a bastard born to the favourite concubine of some far western merchant king. His mother, having fallen pregnant thanks to a forbidden tryst with a minor courtier, had fled the palace to raise him in a secret mountain hideaway. Quo was fond of recalling his early years in the mountains, where he received the fruits of his mother's excellent education in languages and mathematics. However, the merchant king's reach was long, and his desire for vengeance implacable. As his soldiers drew ever nearer, Quoshar's mother grew resigned to her own fate. At best, she would be permitted to commit suicide, and at worst subjected to an inventive form of torture involving 1,000 scorpions and a bed of rusty nails. However, her love for her son was fierce, and she contrived to spirit him to the coast and thence onto a vessel which would carry him far away to a small, damp land beyond the vengeance of the merchant king. Abandoned as an infant on the Varinshold dockside, Quoshar had been forced to make his own way. Thanks to his mother's tutelage, he quickly carved out a place in the spice trade, and in time became something akin to a minor merchant king himself. His success was ostensibly rooted in the lucrative contracts he agreed with ships plying the spice routes to Alpera and beyond. However, his true source of wealth lay in his role as intermediary between those at the top of Varinshold society who wished to make use of the various services only those at the bottom could offer. "Tell me something, Quo," Durla said, poking a toe through the detritus littering the floor of the trader's shop. "Is any of it true?" Quoshar looked up at her from amidst a pile of shattered glass and pottery. Blood leaked from his rapidly swelling nose, staining the fine silks he wore. At her instruction, Gallus and the others had kept the beating brief, but possessed of sufficient bone-breaking force to leave no doubt as to their intent tonight. Quoshar had been wise in employing a trio of bodyguards, but unwise in not employing more. They lay about the ruined shop in various states of bloodied unconsciousness, as Durla's new employees helped themselves to whatever trinkets or stock took their fancy. There were 5 besides Gallus, all willing to work for just 1 gold apiece, another mark of Livera's popularity. "Your fascinating life story, I mean to say," Durla said, moving to crouch at Quoshar's side. She smiled, angling her head and raising an eyebrow. "It's not, is it? Your mother wasn't some tragic heroine saving her darling little bastard from the evil king. Most likely, she was a sea whore who dumped you on the orphanage steps before climbing back on whatever bilge tub brought her here. I'm guessing you never even knew her. It's your accent, you see. Pure Varinshold under all the soft vowels and occasional memorized phrases spoken in a language you don't really know. I'm right, aren't I?" She reached behind her back and drew her knife, Quoshar's eyes widening considerably at the sight of the curved gutting blade. "Your mother was a whore," Durla said, placing the edge of the blade against his cheek. "Just like me and Livera." He tried to speak, producing a bubbling froth of blood and spit instead. Durla let him sputter on until he achieved a modicum of articulation. "I didn't know." "How unusually ignorant of you." Durla turned the blade a little, pressing the edge into the flesh of his face, just enough for a small line of blood to colour the steel. "The client," Quoshar spoke in a rapid, wet babble, "wanted an Alperan girl. Sweet-natured, he said. He was new to the city. I couldn't know his habits." "You're a surprisingly poor liar, Quo." She turned the blade, more blood welling on the edge. "He had help, locals who knew the best place to dump her. Where'd he find them, if not thanks to you?" "He had his own people." Quoshar choked off into a pained squeal as Durla added pressure to the blade. "Meldenians," he went on quickly. "Pirates by the look of them. They know the city as well as any local." Durla glanced over at Gallus, standing close by with his bloodied cudgel at the ready. "Could be," he said with a shrug. "But pirates would have been more likely to finish me off. Meldenians ain't known for their merciful customs." "Killing you would have left them with another bloody body to deal with," she said. "And I'd guess they were in a hurry." Durla returned her gaze to Quoshar, watching the relief flood his eyes as she lifted the knife from his cheek, then flood back in again as she pressed it to his throat. "I know discretion is the foundation stone of your business," she told him, "so I would like to propose a transaction of such profitability as to overcome your admirable scruples. Tell me the client's name and where I can find him, and I won't pull your tongue out through the hole I'm about to carve in your throat." "Nice place," Gallus commented, a small glimmer of greed lighting his gaze as he surveyed the mansion. Durla supposed it was too much to ask for him to forego his thieves' instincts for one night. She had to admit it was an impressive house, standing 3 stories high with numerous windows of glass rather than shutters. It lay just to the north of where the brine wash deepened and curved back on itself for a short stretch, creating a teardrop-shaped bulge where many of the city's merchants made their homes. The depth and course of the river insulated these worthies from Varinshold's less desirable precincts, whilst remaining within the reasonable carriage ride of the docks. They had crossed the river just after the 10th bell tolled, making use of a somewhat leaky boat procured by a bargeman of Gallus's acquaintance. Once ashore, they hid themselves in the deep shadows of the house's exterior wall, Gallus peering through the railings to gauge the best way in. "Plenty of pickings to be had in a house like that," he went on, Durla detecting an obvious question in his tone. "Get me where I need to be," she said, "then the place is yours." "Quo said he's got a wife and 2 daughters. Durla met his gaze, seeing another, weightier question there. "Not my concern," she said. "Or yours," she added, raising her voice to address their 5 compatriots. "Tie them up and gag them, that's all." "And the pirates?" "That's your score to settle. Just don't be too quick about it." "Right then." He settled the coiled rope over his shoulder and reached up to grasp the railings, pausing for a second before hauling himself up. "You know you should have killed Quo, right?" he asked Durla. She ignored the question and gave an impatient flick of her hand. "Get on with it." Gallus pulled on a leather mask that covered the upper side of his face, flashed her a brief grin, and leapt, gripping the top of the railings and vaulting over in an effortless display of his art. He landed softly, took a second to scan the surrounding flower beds, then made a beckoning gesture to the rest of the crew. They duly clambered over the railings to crouch at Gallus's side, whereupon he led them towards the house in a straight sprint across the lawn. Durla lost sight of them as they rounded the mansion's north-facing wall. Now she could only wait. Her eyes flicked from one dim window to another, ears alive for the sound of alarm as the seconds stretched to minutes. She knew Gallus would be climbing the rear of the house, searching for an unsecured window or other useful entry point. Once inside, he would toss the rope to his crew, and the night's business would begin in earnest. She found her hands trembling a little as the minutes dragged by, and frowned in puzzlement as the sweat dampened her palms. Since viewing Livera's corpse, she had felt little save an unwavering sense of purpose, yet now the fear chose to make itself known. Is it fear, she wondered, smoothing her palms over her skirt, or anticipation? The signal came a short while later, a single oil lamp flaring to life in one of the front-facing windows, unnerving in its suddenness as she hadn't detected a single sound during her vigil. Durla rose from her hiding place and made her way to the front gate. It stood closed but unlocked, one of several misjudgments made by the mansion's owner. Gallus opened the front door with a florid bow, stepping aside to allow her entry to a marble-floored lobby from which a curved staircase ascended to the first floor. 4 people lay on the floor, servants by their dress, each with their hands bound behind their backs and gags securely wedged in their mouths. Gallus's crew stood behind them, a few already sporting silver candlesticks and sundry other valuables. "Where's your mask?" Gallus asked, casting a wary glance at the servants who stared up at Durla with bright, wet eyes. "Won't be needing one," she said. Gallus muttered a curse and ordered the servants to close their eyes. "Keep 'em shut tight, you arse-licking fuckers," he growled, "else I'll forget how nice I'm supposed to be tonight." Durla moved to the foot of the staircase, where a body lay sprawled across the lower steps. He was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow, with a face that might have been handsome but for the fresh scar running from his nose to his chin. Blood leaked from the numerous stab wounds visible through his torn shirt. "Too quick for my liking," Gallus said, coming to her side. "Still, it was rightly satisfying." He hesitated. "We didn't get 'em all. The other 2 pirates ran for the cellar. Got one as he was climbing up the coal chute. The other one's gone, though." "The wife and daughters?" Durla asked. "Trussed up in one of the bedrooms, like you said. The merchant's in his study, up the stairs on the left." You and the others better grab what you can and take yourselves off. It's a fair bet the pirate will bring the guard, or run off to tell someone who will. Reckon we've got half an hour or so before they show up. I don't mind waiting. I mind. Durla started up the stairs, then paused and untied the purse from her belt, tossing it to him. Payment. Make sure everyone gets their share. He looked at the purse in his hand, heavy with double the coins she had promised. When he looked up at her once more, his gaze was dark with understanding. Ain't no use nor point in you dying tonight, he said. I died already. She turned away and resumed her ascent. Might as well make it official. You should have been more careful, Durla told the merchant, setting a heavily stained knife down on his desk. And more honest in your dealings with Quo Shah. Had you told him of your true purpose, I'm sure he would have kept you supplied with suitable victims for years, and you and I would never have crossed paths. She moved away, tracing a gore-covered finger over the well-stocked bookshelves in his library. Some volumes were clearly for show. The classics every realm subject of appreciable wealth felt obliged to keep in their home. They were easily distinguished by the uncreased spines and perfect lettering, whilst others showed signs of frequent reading. She paused at one particular tome, a thick book with the title Legends and Myths of the Alpiran Empire, embossed in faded, gold letters on the spine. Ah, she said, plucking the book from the shelf. Lord Al-Avern's much-acclaimed first foray into the scholarly realm, I believe. Clearly you're a man of some taste, sir. She opened the book, leafing through the pages which she found had been defaced by numerous notations in a spidery, almost unreadable script. Words were underlined and passages encircled, the margins crammed with dense scribblings which made little sense to Durla, although the words beauty and blood appeared with the greatest frequency. Keeping hold of the book, she moved to sit in the chair positioned opposite the merchant's desk, turning page after page, decorated with feverishly inscribed gibberish. Eventually she paused at the title page to the final chapter. The Paths of Ravenna. Here the scribblings became so intense they obscured much of the text, the jagged hand-wrought letters overlapping and entwining in an indecipherable melange, although she noted that the word dark was now most often repeated. Alpiran legends, Alpiran victims, she mused, regarding the merchant over the top of the book. And an obsession with the dark. What a curious mad bastard you are. Durla closed the book and tossed it aside, reclining in her seat to stare into the empty eye sockets of the man behind the desk. Did you talk to her first? She asked him. I'm sure you would have found her conversation fascinating. She knew many an old legend from her homeland. Though to her they weren't legends, as she'd get awfully huffy if I ever suggested otherwise. The histories of the gods are not to be made light of, she'd tell me. Livera tended to laugh off most things in life, except any suggestion of insult to her gods, even though they'd never been especially kind to her. Father run off after her mother died bringing her brother into the world, and him taken by the fever before reaching his 10th year. She never told me the truth of why she left the Empire. The story would change. First it was to escape a vicious pimp. Then she claimed she made the mistake of marrying a client and stowing away on a ship to the realm to escape him. Not because he was a bad man, just boring. She could never abide boredom. Durla felt something on her cheeks, a new wetness beyond the sticky spray left by the merchant's opened veins. Oh, how embarrassing, she said, touching her finger to the tears. You'll have to forgive me, sir. Surely I am not fit for such fine company. Her gaze slipped from the merchant's ravaged eyes to his bare chest, punctured by 48 precisely placed stab wounds. Durla had always been good with numbers, and her occupation gave her a reasonable understanding of anatomy, so it hadn't been too difficult to keep him alive for the last 2 blows. Given the man's beastly habits, Durla had expected more of him, some measure of malevolent defiance at least, or perhaps an insight into his evidently diseased mind. But he had acted as any other man might, upon finding himself tied to a chair to be slowly tormented to death by a vengeful whore. Even after she stabbed out his eyes, he lingered for a while, gibbering slurred pleas to spare his family, until finally his head slumped to his chest and he left the world with a small, almost wistful sigh. Durla's numbness had lingered throughout it all, her heart maintaining a steady rhythm, untroubled by either enjoyment or pity. Except now it was done. There were tears. A loud thud echoed from downstairs, quickly followed by two more and the sound of splintering wood. Durla got to her feet, her gaze shifting to the knife lying on the desk. If she had it in hand when the guard entered the room, it would save a lot of tedious rigmarole. "No," the voice whispered in her mind as she reached for the knife. It was Livera's voice, as clear and real as if she stood at her shoulder. Durla froze, an icy chill vying with joy in her breast. "You're not here," Durla groaned in grim realization. "There are no whispers on the wind. I just wanted to hear your voice once more. You died. You died." "No," Livera's voice told her, rich in the sweet kindness that had killed her. "You didn't." Durla found herself withdrawing her hand, letting it fall to her side. She turned as the first guardsman burst into the room, a bearded sergeant with a drawn sword who drew up in shock at the sight that greeted him. "Took you fuckers long enough to get here," Durla told him, putting her hands on her hips. Chapter 6. The man had to stoop a little in order to enter her cell, being so tall. He was old. The wrinkles on his face and the grey shining in his hair and beard told her that. But he stood with the straight-backed surety of a much younger man, and Durla could see an intelligence in his eyes that no amount of years could dim. The jailer's lamp caught the ermine hem of the old man's cloak as he stood regarding her in wordless scrutiny for a time. It was the first true light Durla had seen in over a week. She was somewhere deep, she knew that. Also somewhere far from the vaults into which she had expected to be cast, to wait out the days until her hearing before the magistrate and inevitable hanging. Instead, a few hours' detention at the city guardhouse had ended with a bag being thrown over her head. There had been lots of shoving, a carriage ride, then more shoving as she tripped her way down numerous steps before the bag had been unceremoniously torn away, affording her the brief sight of the cell door slamming closed. Since then, all had been darkness, save for the brief glimmer of lantern light once a day when the jailer pushed bread and water through a slot in the base of the door. Durla surmised this was all intended to drive her to madness, leave the vile torturess to scream and wail in the dark for the rest of her days. But she didn't go mad. She waited, for some small instinct told her there was more to this torment than punishment. And so it proved. She sat with her back to the wall and knees drawn up, returning the old man's scrutiny until he said, "Is this how you greet your king?" She saw it then, as he angled his head to reveal a prominent nose and strong jaw. It was a profile she knew well, having been stamped onto every coin she had earned over the past 10 years. Durla got to her feet and dropped into a deep curtsy, keeping her head lowered until he spoke again. "All right. Give me that." She looked up to see him taking the lantern from the jailer. "Close the door. I'll knock when you're needed." The jailer hesitated, his brutish features hardening as he glanced at Durla. "They say this one's awful vicious, Highness." "I'll knock when you're needed," the king said, softly but precisely. The jailer didn't so much retreat as vanish, the door slamming shut and leaving a loud echo. "Any notion of where you are?" the king asked Durla as the echo faded. Durla began to give a subservient head bob, but stopped at the king's exclamation. "Ah! Enough of that. Speak plainly, woman." "This is not the vaults," Durla said, finding she had to swallow to get the words out. Days in the silent dark made speech feel strange in her mouth, her voice sounding far too calm and detached to be real. "No, it is not," the king agreed. "Then where else could it be? The black hold, perhaps? Only deniers and those who pretend to know the dark end up in the black hold, and I am neither. Besides, the carriage that brought me here passed along Mending's Way before crossing the bridge south of Watcher's Bend." "How could you possibly know that?" "The cobbles are smoother. the closer you get to the northern quarter, and that particular bridge has the highest arch in the city." She saw a small flicker of emotion pass across the king's face, too quick to judge his feelings, but she fancied it was either amusement or satisfaction. "Very astute of you. Therefore I consider it will be an easy matter for you to deduce your current whereabouts." Durla had in fact considered, then discounted this possibility, the notion being so absurd. Now it seemed her judgment had been all too accurate. "The palace," she said. "I'm in the palace. About 30 feet below the wine stores, actually, but close enough." The king came closer, holding out the lantern to fully illuminate Durla's face, his eyes narrowing in an appraisal that she knew had nothing to do with lust. "Do you know how much the man you killed was worth?" he asked. "A great deal of money, I imagine. Worth is not always measured in wealth. I do not mean the gold he piled up or the ships and houses he accrued. I mean his worth to this realm. In particular, his worth to me. What worth would a just king find in so perverted and murderous a soul?" "None." The king's teeth gleamed yellow in the lantern's glow as he drew back his lips in a smile. "I, however, found a great deal of worth in him. I am frequently unjust in my governance of this realm, but any injustice is the product of necessity. I didn't know of the merchant's peculiar tastes, and had I known, he would most likely be dead by my order rather than your hand. But—" the king's smile had gone now, and his face was a mask of intense sincerity. "Only after I had ensured someone of equal worth could take his place. You should understand this about your king, if our association is to continue." "Continue?" Durla asked. Having presumed herself dead, the prospect of deliverance felt strange, adding an unexpected energy to her pulse and sweat to her hands. She tried to hide it by folding her arms, but knew the old man had seen it. He smiled again, with a semblance of kindness this time, before moving back, the lantern's glow shrinking. Durla resisted the lure of the light. She suspected he wouldn't be impressed if she were to follow him dog-like about her cell. "You identified and killed the merchant in a matter of hours," the king said, "despite the efforts he made to obscure his trail. Such an achievement is evidence of a considerable set of skills, not to mention a singularity of purpose, both traits I can make use of." The lantern shrank into a glowing ball at the far end of her cell, illuminating the door. The king raised a hand to knock, then stopped. Durla couldn't make out his face now, but knew he had turned his scrutiny upon her once more. "Just one other thing," he said. "Your accomplices." "I have no accomplices," she replied. "I was called to the merchant's house to provide my particular brand of services. He tried to strangle me, then produced a knife, avowing his intention to have his way with my corpse. I killed him in defense of my own life. Everything that was done by my own hand and no other." "Yes, so you told the city guard. However, the merchant's servants say otherwise, as do his family. Their testimony indicates your visit was driven by a desire for personal retribution. Liars, seeking to explain away their own cowardice and shameful complicity in his crimes. If I am to find a use for your skills, there can be no one to gainsay the story we must weave to explain your release. Without the names of your friends, I may as well just leave you here." Durla's face was fixed on the king's hand, the bony fist poised an inch or two from the door. When she spoke, the words scraped over her throat like a blacksmith's file. "I had no accomplices." A soft sigh in the darkness, then 2 sharp raps of his fist on the door. "Loyalty," the king said as the jailer worked the key in the lock. "Also a useful trait." He raised the lantern and stood aside, gesturing at the open door. "Come along, my good woman. There is something I would like to show you." Who was she? The body hung in the gibbet, a slumped tangle of skin and bone wrapped in mildewed rags. The crows were at it, one pecking at the tattered flesh of the corpse's feet, whilst another worried its beak in the dead woman's vacant eye socket. "As mad and wretched a soul as you are ever likely to meet," the king told Durla. "She killed her children, some delusion regarding denier beliefs. Apparently she was fully convinced that once dead, they would rise again imbued with all manner of dark gifts. She managed to hang herself before they could administer justice, but the Fourth Order still felt obliged to string her up in the cage. Appearance's sake, I suppose. It is my belief that her passing was in fact a mercy, for herself and the realm. And her connection to me? Durla asked, quickly adding, Highness, as the king raised an eyebrow. He had led her, accompanied by 2 palace guards, to the parapet above the north gate, where the bodies decayed in their iron cages, leaking a thick stench of corruption into the misted morning air. The hour was early, the sun only just beginning to crest the rooftops, and there were no eyes to witness their visit save the guards at the gate, who were conscientious in averting their gaze. She is you, the king explained. Or rather, she is the inheritor of your crime. Having killed her children, she then paid a visit to the merchant's house. Apparently her ritual required the blood of a rich man. Durla watched the crow withdraw its beak from the eye socket. It angled its head at her for a moment, black eyes flashing white as it blinked, gave a brief squawk, and returned to its meal. Inquisitive creature, the crow, the king observed. Curiosity is the principal trait of all scavengers, coupled with keen eyesight and remarkable patience. Tell me, what does your inquisitive nature tell you at this very moment? She was a denier, so her crimes lay outside the scope of Crown law, Durla said. She would have been judged by the Fourth Order. The details of their judgments are never revealed. Quite so. As you have no doubt discerned, the Fourth Order and I have our little arrangements. What a clever crow you are. Durla removed her gaze from the feasting scavenger and afforded the king another curtsy. Thank you, Highness. It was a trifling issue, really. The merchant's family and servants were another matter. Durla kept her features impassive as the king's gaze lingered on her, searching, she assumed, for any sign of concern. Don't worry, they're alive, he went on, although shipping the entire household off to the northern reaches wasn't an inexpensive exercise. The merchant's wife has been allotted a generous pension, on the understanding that it will disappear the moment she ever again makes mention of her husband's ugly demise. Did she know, Highness? Durla asked. About his habits. I expect so. Wives always see more than you want them to. He grinned a little, reading the dark shade that had crept into Durla's gaze. Wishing you'd killed her too now, aren't you? The crow squawked again, flapping its wings in warning as its companion began to clamber up the cage. My wishes are now for you to ordain, Highness, Durla said. His grin broadened into a laugh, and he turned away, beckoning another man forward. He was of trim build, and an inch or two shorter than average, his features lean but otherwise bland. His clothes were similarly nondescript, reasonably well tailored but lacking anything that might draw the eye. For Durla, the most significant thing about him was that she had failed to make any note of his presence until now. Allow me to introduce you to Master Alveric, the king said as the bland-faced man bowed to him. He'll be your tutor for the next few weeks. Skilled as you are, the mere fact of your capture indicates you have a great deal yet to learn. You'll find him a kindly teacher, for the most part, with many a clever trick to impart. I call him my Lord of Foxes. You, however— The king's gaze switched between Durla and the now squabbling crows on the gibbet. Will be my Lady of Crows. You do know how to play warrior's bluff, I assume? The Lady of Crows was one of the cards forming the noble suit, found in the standard Australian card deck. The more superstitious souls amongst the gambling fraternity tended to regard it as an ill-luck card, the kind that would turn up in a winning hand only for the victor to keel over stone dead a moment later. I know the game very well, Highness, Durla said. The king gave Master Alveric a slightly smug glance before moving back to the parapet. I'll leave you to get better acquainted, he said. It's unlikely we'll meet more than once a year from now on, but rest assured, any instruction you receive from my Lord of Foxes is to be regarded as a royal command. Durla curtsied as he walked away with a brisk step, his 2 guards hurrying in his wake. Master Alveric stood regarding Durla in silence for a second, a faint animosity discernible behind his otherwise placid gaze. Not his idea to recruit me, she realized. "Go home," Alveric said abruptly. "Resume your normal routine. Re-establish your standing amongst the criminal element." With that, he turned to go. "King Janus said you would be my tutor," Durla said. Alveric paused to offer her the briefest glance. "Your education has already begun," he told her before turning and walking away once more. Durla hearing him adding in a low mutter, "The first lesson being the value of following instructions." Chapter 7. "Put it on." Durla eyed the garment set out on the table. It was a dress, finely crafted from silk and lace, with a red and black skirt and bodice to match. Fine as the dress was, her attention was mostly occupied by the sheathed dagger that sat beside it. "Will it fit?" she asked. "My dimensions are a little out of the ordinary, you may have noticed." She favoured Master Alveric with a smile and arched eyebrow. "It will fit perfectly," he said without any discernible change of expression. "Put it on." Durla sighed and glanced around the unadorned dining room. She had woken this morning to find a note had been pushed under her door sometime during the night. On it, the location of this house had been printed in small, neat letters. It was a plain, freestanding, two-story dwelling positioned halfway along Hawker Street, the kind of place a man might buy when he's done well for himself, but not so well as to secure a residence in the northern quarter proper. Alveric had answered the door after the first knock, and led her wordlessly to this room where the dagger and the dress were waiting. "You expect me to strip in front of you?" she asked Alveric. "I do," he replied, as tonelessly as before. "Despite my occupation, I do retain some notions of modesty, you know." "No." A certain hardness crept into Alveric's voice then, his eyes locking with hers. "You do not, because the king requires it, as he requires you to put on this dress." She swallowed a tart reply and turned away, hands moving to the laces on her bodice. She forced herself to undress without any obvious haste, unwilling to allow him the notion that she might be flustered. "I usually insist on payment up front," she said, turning to face him, a hand on her hip. She had expected some sort of advance, an attempt to extort services from her, or face a return to the unlit cell beneath the palace. "A small mole on your right upper thigh," he said. "A deep crescent-shaped scar on your shoulder. Distinguishing marks that will enable me to identify your corpse should it be discovered without a head." He nodded once again at the dress. "Put it on." He hadn't been lying about the fit. The dress had evidently been made for her, without benefit of a measuring string. It was in fact the most well-tailored garment she could remember wearing. It was also remarkably light, and she couldn't contain a small laugh of appreciation as she strolled from one end of the room to the other. A garb that, to all appearances, should have rendered her clumsy and short of breath, in fact allowed for remarkable comfort and ease of movement. "Quite a gift, Master Alveric," she said with a curtsy. "My thanks, sir." He ignored her, and moved to her discarded clothes, which now lay neatly folded on the table. A moment's rummaging, and his hand emerged holding her curved gutting knife. "This is effective," he said, setting the weapon aside, "but too messy. Precision—" He lifted the sheathed dagger from the table and tossed it to her. "Will be your watchword from now on." Durla's hand explored the dagger's plain redwood handle for a moment. Like the dress, it fitted her perfectly. Drawing the knife, she found it had a 6-inch blade with an edge that seemed to cut the light as it caught it. "Very nice," she said, hefting the weapon. "Feels a little light, though." "Lightness equates to speed," Alveric said, "and speed is more important than strength." With that, he punched her in the stomach. The blow was hard enough to make her stagger, grunting in pain, but not so hard as to be incapacitating. Durla's reaction was swift, street-honed instincts making her lash out at Alveric's eyes with the dagger. He made no move to evade or block the blow, and it was his calm, narrow gaze as the blade flashed closer that made her stop. The tip of the dagger hovered next to his left eye, twitching as she struggled to contain her anger. "You do like your tests, don't you?" she asked, stepping back and returning the blade to its sheath. "The people you will be set against," Alveric replied, "will test you far more than I ever will. This is not a game, and we are not engaged in chasing phantoms. The threats to the crown and the realm are real and manifold." He ran his gaze over her once more, nodding in slight satisfaction. "A good fit. More dresses will be delivered to you tomorrow. You will find each has several concealed pockets for weapons or messages. Familiarize yourself with them and report here after the midday bell for more instruction." "Eyes? Blue. Hair? Light brown. Accent? North Australian with a touch of the Renfalian border country. Rings?" Durla hesitated, her mind racing to recall every detail of the man she had been instructed to observe. "He wore gloves," she remembered. "Thick gloves, the kind worn by a cavalryman. So no rings." She began to reply, then stopped as her memory dredged up an additional detail, something she hadn't been aware of her eyes capturing at the time. "A thin band on the small finger of his right hand," she said. "Silver or steel, worn over his gloves." Alveric looked at her across the table. Durla had been reporting to this house every 7 days for the past 6 weeks, and in that time she hadn't seen another occupant besides Alveric. She would knock on the front door, he would admit her, and she would be led to the dining room. The first 2 weeks had been taken up with his particular brand of instruction, usually involving a brief but bruising round of hand-to-hand combat in which she invariably came off worst. It had quickly become apparent to her that Alveric was a far more dangerous individual than she could ever hope to be. She could fight, she knew that, but she also knew herself to be a brawler at heart. The streets had taught her the value of combining aggression with a certain lack of restraint. Alveric was a craftsman in comparison, countering her every clumsy move with a fluid grace and economy of movement that left her in no doubt as to her own skills. She did improve, however, learning his more obvious tricks and even managing to dodge a blow or two. But it was only when she managed to wrestle herself free of a chokehold that he called a halt to this phase of her instruction. "Your first assignment," he said, handing her a rolled-up piece of parchment. Durla unfurled it to find it held a few lines of script set down in the same neat hand as the note that had been pushed under her door. 40 to 50 years old, bearded, wears shoes of red leather, the Seahorse Inn. "Follow and report," Alveric told her. "Do not be seen." So she followed the man with the red leather shoes and reported on his movements. The next week, she followed a plump washerwoman employed at a nobleman's mansion. This week, the young Realm Guard cavalryman with the steel or silver ring. With every new assignment, the amount of information she was expected to provide increased, and it was a continual marvel to her that her mind managed to accumulate so much detail. But then, the knowledge that Alveric might tell the king that her usefulness had in fact proven illusory was a persistent and effective spur to enhanced efforts. "His companion at dinner?" Alveric inquired. "A sailor, garbed as a South Cambralian, but his accent was poor. I'd guess Meldenian." "Guess?" Durla swallowed a sigh. Alveric was irksomely insistent on a formal and uncoloured report, free of what he termed ill-informed conjecture. "It is my belief," Durla said, "that the subject's dinner companion was a Meldenian attempting to disguise his origins with his garb and a false accent." "Their conversation?" "Ribald talk of the best whores and taverns to be found in the city. However, I have never heard the names of the whores they mentioned. Also, one of the taverns they spoke of burnt down 2 years ago." Alveric's gaze grew ever so slightly more intent, his trim frame inching forward in his seat. "And what did you conclude from this?" he asked. Durla had yet to see the man exhibit any obvious emotion, but knew anticipation when she saw it. He is hoping for a wrong answer, she realized. They were speaking in code. She reached into her bodice, plucking a thin paper scroll from between her breasts and laying it on the table. "A verbatim account of their conversation," she said, managing to keep the self-satisfied tone from her voice. which I believe will assist in deciphering said code." Alveric's eyes flicked to the paper before he reclined, making no move to pick it up. "What do you know of a ship called the Margentis?" he asked instead. Durla had become accustomed to such abrupt changes in subject. Every time she completed a task, he would offer no thanks or any indication as to the quality of her work, and simply issue a new set of instructions. She suspected she would never know what use might be made of the information. "It's a Meldenian fighter," she said. "Works the red flower trade from Valeria. The captain's never been openly linked to piracy, but he's known to bring stolen cargo here once a year to fence on behalf of his fellow captains from the Isles." Durla hesitated, but only for a second. The information she was about to reveal was dangerous, but she no longer harboured any doubts as to which king presented the most potent threat in this city. A man named Hunsel has a monopoly over all pirate goods landed in Varensold, although he's better known as One-Eye these days. There's always a celebration of sorts when the Margentis arrives. The most prominent members of the criminal element gather aboard ship to whore and drink, apart from Hunsel himself, who's rarely seen outside his den these days. "Whoring and drinking?" Alveric said. "What about gambling?" Durla recalled the smug expression on the king's face that morning atop the gatehouse when he asked if she knew how to play warrior's bluff. "So, this is what he spared me for," she surmised. "Dice and such," she replied. "But there's only one game that matters. The Invitational. The best gamblers in the realm would be invited to take part in a game of warrior's bluff. It's always the richest game of the year. Each player is required to have at least 500 golds in their purse before sitting down. None can leave the table until they lose every coin or win the game." "You have attended this celebration in the past?" "Just once, some years ago. It wasn't to my professional tastes. I prefer more civilized and less inebriated clientele. There is a man, a recent arrival in the city, who has nevertheless rapidly acquired a reputation for skill at cards. It is believed he will soon receive an invitation to join the game aboard the Margentis. You will make his acquaintance, win his trust, and accompany him to the ship when the time comes." Durla frowned. This was the first time she had been instructed to make herself known to a subject. "As you wish. Where do I find him?" "Most nights at the House of Blue Orchids. I trust you're familiar with the establishment." "It's a red flower palace and whorehouse, not one of the nice ones. I'll need 10 silvers to pay off the owner before she'll let me in. A matter of courtesy, you see. Keep a tabulated list of any expenses incurred. It will be paid in full at the conclusion of your task." "My task being to simply keep this card-sharp company?" "His presence in the city is the result of a royal command. Although he is officially a favoured guest of the king, and may enjoy all the freedoms afforded any other realm subject, it is important that this fiction continue. Your task is to ensure that his recreational pursuits don't see him floating in the harbour with his throat slit." Alveric leaned forward once more, meeting her gaze and speaking in a soft, flat tone that left an unwelcome chill in Durla's breast. "Rest assured," the Lord of Foxes told her, "that whatever favour you enjoy with the king will disappear should any harm come to this man. Your continued survival is now entirely dependent on this." Durla nodded, managing to contain the growing list of questions crowding her head, except one. "Might I know his name?" "His name is Sentis Muster, heir to the fief lordship of Cumbrail. He'll be easy to find by virtue of his accent and the fact that he is invariably by far the drunkest soul at any gathering." Chapter 8. "Cowards, I call you!" Sentis Muster rose to strike a pose rich in theatrical disdain as the last of his opponents slunk away from the card table. An untidy pile of coins lay beside the Cumbralian's overturned cards, which Durla was surprised to see, displayed a poor hand. The blind blacksmith being the most high-valued card, and the 5 others all drawn from the lesser suits. In all, the hand's value amounted to less than half that of Muster's final adversary, and yet this overly vocal drunk had managed to bluff his way to victory. The entire game had lasted barely 2 hours, something of a record in Durla's experience. "Is there no one in this den of vice with the stomach to face me?" the Cumbralian demanded, sweeping his wine cup from the table, raising it high and spilling a portion of the contents in the process. Beyond the glow of the lantern, suspended above the table, the shadows stirred, with a few grumbles and muttered insults, but none of the Blue Orchid's patrons rose to the taunt. Instead, the clientele preferred to return their attentions to their paid companions or overpriced drinks. Scentus Muster maintained his pose for a few seconds, his expression of resolute challenge slowly subsiding into resigned chagrin. "Clearly I have milked this particular teat dry," he sighed, sinking back into his seat. He took several long gulps from his wine cup before setting it down and embarking on a clumsy attempt to assemble his winnings into some semblance of order, muttering, "My brother always said true skill was more a burden than a blessing. The measure of a man lies in how he profits from his labour." Muster looked up as Durla stepped into the light, his brows raised in surprise, and she was gratified to see no small measure of carnal interest. "The humble woodcutter who spends his earnings on food for the needy," Darla went on, "is to be valued more than the man who carves the finest statue and fritters his wealth on vice." "What an unexpected delight," Muster said, getting unsteadily to his feet. "To meet an Israelian lady educated in the 10 books." He bowed, one arm across his midriff, and the other extended to the side in what she assumed was the Cumbralian courtly fashion. "Lord Scentus Muster, my lady, at your service." She responded with a curtsy. "A pleasure, my lord. So—" She moved to his side, leaning close to collect the cards, lingering a second to allow him to catch the scent of her perfume, before circling the table to retrieve the others. "Shall we play?" "You're fond of cards, then, my lady?" "I play fairly well, so I'm told." Durla took the seat 2 chairs away from his, a decently enticing remove that allowed the lamplight to play over her cleavage to good effect. She met his gaze and gave a small smile as she shuffled the cards, her hands working the deck with unconscious precision. "Fairly well won't do, I'm afraid," Muster advised with a regretful wince. "Not against me. And I shouldn't wish to alienate so charming a companion. Why don't we have a drink instead?" He waved his wine cup, and a serving girl duly arrived bearing a fresh bottle and another cup for Durla. "Are you new to this house, perhaps?" Muster asked Durla as the girl poured the wine. "I feel certain I would have recalled seeing you here before." "I'm not employed in this establishment," Durla replied, fanning the cards on the baize. "I merely came to play, and will consider myself sorely aggrieved should you deny me, my lord." Muster's eyes narrowed a little as he raised his cup to his nose, though the smile lingered on his lips. "A pale red from the Mentari vineyards," he said, sniffing. "One of the south-facing slopes. 3 years old. It rained more than usual that summer." He took a sip and pursed his lips, shrugging. "Possible, but Lord Mentari should really stick to the whites. Too much sand in his soil for a decent red. I'd have to write him an advisory letter one of these days." He set the cup down and turned to the serving girl. "I think my new adversary would appreciate something more full-bodied, my dear. Bring us the Umblin Valley Red, if you please. Now then." He turned back to Durla, clasping his hands together. "What shall we say for the opening bet? Does 2 silvers seem fair?" Durla met his gaze again, fixing it with a half-smile. "I regret I'd neglected to bring any coin tonight, my lord." An extra line or two appeared in Muster's already creased brow as he gave a small huff of annoyance. "Charming as you are, I do not play for mere amusement. A game with nothing at risk is a dull affair indeed." "Oh," Durla said, sweeping the cards and dealing out 2 hands with practised ease. "I'm sure we can think of something worth playing for." "Sorry," Muster groaned, breath hot and laboured against her neck as he subsided atop her. "Too much wine. If only the Umblin vintages weren't so confoundedly tempting." "I think you more than demonstrated your fortitude, my lord," Durla said as he rolled off her. His frame was a curious mix of bony and flabby, a substantial paunch married to spindly arms and legs, and yet he had proven more accomplished a bedmate than most of her clients, if somewhat lacking in stamina. "How kind you are," he said in a sleepy murmur. "I hope it's not extra." "You won the bet," she reminded him, shifting to lay her head on his chest. "Everything's on the house tonight." He played a hand through her hair, fingers tracing gently through the thick auburn curls. "You shared these rooms with someone until recently," he said. "How long since they left?" Durla stiffened, all artifice suddenly draining from her as she withdrew from him and turned away. She sat on the edge of the bed, frozen and staring into the dark until she felt his hand on her back. "I apologize," he said. "Clearly I have overstepped." "You see a great deal, my lord," she said. "Life as a drunk has a few advantages. Being continually underestimated is one of them." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder before climbing free of the bed and reaching for his clothes. "I should go. The palace guards get a mite prissy with me if I don't stumble back before daybreak." "Palace?" she asked. Before now she had assumed he had a house of his own somewhere in the city. "Oh, yes," he replied, pulling his shirt on. "I am a guest of His Highness King Janus al Niran. I even have a courtly title, Minister of Cumbralian Affairs. Fortunately, it doesn't involve a great deal of work beyond signing the occasional document I'm not even required to read." He managed to don his trews after a protracted struggle, then perched on the bed, attempting to pull on one of his shoes without much success. "Allow me," Durla said, kneeling to maneuver the shoe in place before tying up the laces. Muster watched her, unshaven features suddenly sagging into a morose grimace. "In truth, I'm no more a guest than a dog is a guest in his master's kennel." Durla reached for the other shoe. "Then why stay?" His face gave a brief twitch of amusement. "Your question implies a choice in the matter, my dear, and I assure you I have none. What hostage would choose to stay in his prison? Although," Muster smiled as he reached out to caress her hair once more, "I find I grow increasingly fond of the distractions to be found in this particular prison." "Hostage?" Durla finished tying the shoe and rose to retrieve his cloak. "Oh, yes." Muster rose to a reasonably steady stance and turned so she could fasten the cloak about his shoulders. "The king imagines having me in his clutches is surety against any mischief my father might get up to. A surprising misjudgment for a man of such renowned insight." He turned, leaning close to kiss her, more fulsomely this time, then shifted to whisper in her ear. "Between us, he chose the wrong son." He gave a conspiratorial wink, then started towards the door. "You're always welcome here, my lord," Durla said. "Pleasing distractions are my business, after all." He paused and turned back, eyebrow raised at a knowing angle. "And I can assume the next appointment won't be free." "It depends." She watched him ponder for a second, hand hesitant on the door latch. "On what, might I inquire?" "Cards," she said. "You play better than anyone I know, and I know many a card player." "You wish me to teach you?" "If you're so minded, although I find I learn best through simple observation." She saw his brow furrow once more, eyes narrowing in calculation. She could see the depth of his intelligence in that frown. It was one she had often seen on her father's face. Drunk or not, he's far from stupid. "The Margentis," Muster said finally, grinning a little. "Heard about my invitation, did you? Keen to get yourself aboard? For what, may I ask? I find it hard to believe you're short of custom." "I'm not. But I do have a keen eye for fresh opportunities. Besides the Invitational, there are numerous other games played aboard the Margentis. Games frequented by inebriated outlaws, likely to underestimate a whore, as many underestimate a drunk." Muster thought for a moment and shrugged. "Oh, why not? It'll be amusing if nothing else. Though I'm told they're a rowdy lot, the kind that might not take well to having their purses emptied by a woman, or anyone else for that matter. Your concern is touching. She moved to him, planted a kiss on his cheek, and opened the door to usher him out. But I have a sense my reputation will protect me. Reputation? He asked, lingering at the top of the stairs. For what? Merely a spot of torture along the way, my lord. Best not keep the palace guards waiting. Chapter 9. The Margentus lay at anchor a good distance beyond the outer mole of Varensholt harbour, presumably as surety against the night's festivities, attracting any unwanted attention from the city guard. She was one of the largest ships Durla had seen, broad in the beam with 3 tall masts and a wide, curving hull. The freighter reminded her of a toad squatting atop a lily pad in the way she rose from the surrounding cluster of boats. The dozens of small craft that had conveyed a host of senior Varensholt criminality from the docks were all tethered together, forming an undulating walkway across which Durla and her lordly companion were obliged to navigate in order to reach the ship. I've always regarded sea travel as an unnatural pursuit, Muster griped as he made a clumsy leap from one bobbing deck to another. If the World Father wanted us to traverse the oceans, he would surely have given us fins. Not so much farther now, my lord, Durla said, glancing up at the ship's hull. The portholes were all open and brightly lit from within, casting forth a discordant chorus of raucous merriment. It appears we've arrived somewhat late to this gathering. A certain lack of punctuality is expected of the noble class, dearest Durla. It's one of the tricks we use to maintain the illusion of innate superiority. My father kept my mother and the entire Cumbralian nobility waiting for several hours on his wedding day, although rumour has it the delay could be blamed on a dalliance with a maid in the mansion house cellar, not to mention the fact that he detested the very sight of his bride, of course. Durla allowed a reluctant smile to play over her lips. She had been in his company most nights over the preceding 2 weeks, during which time Muster's facility for indiscretion had been one of his more endearing traits. She found herself harbouring a slight resentment at his ability to make her like him. It chafed on her professional instincts, both as a spy and a whore. He's a client and a subject of the king's scrutiny, she reminded herself, not for the first time. Nothing more. After several minutes of precarious navigation, they came to a steep gangway ascending from the deck of a large boat lashed to the ship's hull. Muster was not the most physically able of men, and spent a long moment gasping for breath after they stepped onto the upper deck. Lord Sentis Muster and companion. Durla introduced them to a pair of scowling Meldenian guards as Muster leaned heavily on the rail, too winded to speak. We're expected. He is, one of the Meldenians replied, a hand resting on the hilt of his sabre as he jerked his chin at Muster. You aren't. Mistress Durla, Muster began, wheezing as he straightened to address the guard in lofty tones, is here at my invitation. If her presence is unacceptable, we shall adjourn forthwith. He turned back to the gangplank, gesturing for Durla to follow. All right, the Meldenian growled. Your whore can stay. He turned and nodded at the stairwell leading to the hold. A heavy glow emanated from the hatch along with the sound of many voices raised in inebriated jocularity. Better get yourself seated, my lord, the Meldenian said, offering Muster a humourless grin. The invitational was supposed to start an hour ago, and your opponents aren't the most patient of folk. The hold was thick with noise and the mingled scent of 5-leaf and spilled ale. Men grouped together to play dice or cards, whilst others nuzzled the giggling, barely dressed women in their laps, or dragged them into a secluded alcove for more fulsome entertainment. Durla recognized various outlaw luminaries amongst the throng, along with their more senior lieutenants. She drew a few nods of recognition as she and Muster made their way aft, though most of the assembly were too drunk or lost in the varied delights on offer to afford her much attention. However, there was one exception, picked out of the crowd thanks to her recently honed observational skills. He was a slender fellow with long hair, leaning against a barrel and regarding her with a steady gaze as he puffed from a long-stemmed pipe. A pipe, Durla saw, that had no smoke rising from the bowl. She knew him only as the Stitcher, due to his rumoured habit of stitching closed the wounds of those he tortured, so they wouldn't bleed to death too quickly. One-Eye's man, she recalled, allowing her gaze to slip over the slender man's face without obvious sign of recognition. Not drunk, and puffing an empty pipe. Her gaze found two more of One-Eye's crew in the crowd as she continued to follow Muster forward, a stocky man known for his skills with the cudgel, and a woman of far more worrying abilities. She was small and slight, with a deceptively sweet countenance. Durla had never learned her true name, but she had earned plenty of others in recent years, the most notorious of which was Lady Venom. She possessed a similar talent to Little Dot, but whereas the diminutive healer's skills were directed towards preserving life, Lady Venom's was skewed very much to the opposite. Like the Stitcher, neither the cudgel expert nor Lady Venom showed any signs of intoxication, keeping to the shadows and taking no part in games or carnality. He must have sent them to oversee the festivities, she decided, although it wasn't their typical role. Keeping watch on gatherings like this was a task usually reserved for low-status thugs, like Ratter and Draker. But as she had expected, those two had vanished from the city soon after Frentis's as-yet unexplained disappearance. Perhaps he is short-handed. The notion afforded only a small crumb of comfort, and she found she had to resist the impulse to place a reassuring hand on the knife concealed at the small of her back. After much jostling, they came to the wide oval table where the invitational would take place. A burly Meldenian sat at the table with three other men. He was marked out as the captain of the Margentis by the red scarf on his head, which added a tinge of fury to his countenance as he growled, "Where the fuck have you been?" at Muster. "Where the fuck have you been, my lord, if you don't mind?" Muster replied in a brisk but affable tone as he took a seat to the captain's left. "I do prefer a civil tone when at the table." This drew a laugh from two of the others and another growl from the captain. "No lords on this ship or at this table," he said. "Here there's just cards and the luck the gods allow us." "Luck," Muster repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What a quaint notion of this game you have, good sir." He smiled at the captain's deepening glower, spreading his hands. "Shall we be about it?" The captain gave another growl, wordless this time, then turned to beckon a short, neatly attired man from the shadows. "Wentel," the Meldenian said, and the short man gave a respectful nod to the players. "Our dealer for tonight. He's renowned in Varensold and beyond as an honest pair of hands. Any who find him unacceptable, speak now and state your reasons." "I've had the pleasure of sitting at Master Wentel's table before," Muster said, "and I find him more than acceptable." The man seated on Muster's left was of dark complexion, and clad in silks that marked him out as Alpiran from the western provinces of the Empire. He bared a wall of gold-inlaid teeth in a smile and inclined his head at Wentel, speaking in softly accented realm tongue. "I too know this man, as both skilled and honest. Acceptable." The man on the Alpiran's left was large, unshaven, and seemed to have been wearing the same clothes for at least a week, judging by the multiple wine and food stains besmirching the fabric, and his somewhat ripe aroma. He spared Wentel a brief glance, large shoulders moving in a shrug as he muttered, "Acceptable," in a gruff Nilsalian accent. Durla couldn't see the face of the final player who sat directly opposite Muster. He reclined in his chair, features lost in the shadow beyond the reach of the lantern hanging from the beams above. Durla noted that he was of athletic build with a pair of broad, strong hands resting on the table. She saw 2 points of light glimmer in the shadow that masked the man's face, and realized he had blinked. But the two glimmers didn't match. One was small and bright, whilst the other was duller, as if the lamplight caught something other than an eye. She managed to conceal a start, as the familiar voice came from the shadows, a voice she had heard only a few times, but had hoped to never hear again. "Unacceptable," said Hunsel, king of the Varensold criminal class, now better known as One-Eye. He lifted one of his broad hands and pointed a finger across the table, a finger aimed straight at Durla. "I want her." Chapter 10. "The Cumbraelin's doxy?" The captain scoffed as One-Eye's finger continued to point at Durla. I think not. Silence reigned at the table for a full minute, during which the scorn slowly faded from the captain's brow. The moment ended when Master Wentel, now noticeably more pale of face, turned about and walked swiftly into the shadows. "Are there any objections?" the captain inquired, voice suddenly hoarse and sweat staining his headscarf. None of the other players said a word, although Muster turned to afford Durla a puzzled frown. She laid a hand on his shoulder, leaning close to nuzzle his ear. "Don't drink anything," she whispered, squeezing his shoulder hard to emphasize the point before moving to take the dealer's chair to the right of the captain. "Standard rules?" she asked, reaching for the deck. "Australian no blind," the captain said. "Minimum bet 1 gold per hand, fold or not." Durla fanned the deck before giving it a rapid but thorough shuffle. The cards were all brand new, the ink fresh and the colours vibrant. She could see no obvious marks amid the spiral patterns on the back of each card, nor any subtle changes in dimensions which might afford a dishonest player an advantage. "As per the rules of Australian no blind," she said, cards flying across the table as she dealt, 6 cards to each player. "All folded hands and exchange cards to be shown. Coins in the pot, if you please, good sirs." She watched each player toss a single gold coin into the centre of the table before checking their hand. Their experience was evident in the care with which they kept any expression from their faces, apart from the captain, who bit down a curse and flipped his cards over with a distinct lack of grace. "Owes his invitation to the captaincy of this vessel," Durla decided, responding to the man's suspicious glare with a placid smile before turning her attention to the other players. Muster exchanged 2 cards from his hand, the candle and the poisoned cup, both low-value cards typically discarded at this stage of the game. The gold-toothed Alpiran exchanged 3 similarly poor cards, and the ill-smelling Nilsalin 1. Durla watched One Eye's finger tap out a slow drumbeat. After a moment, he shifted in his seat, leaning forward so that the lamplight revealed his face. He had been handsome before, possessed of well-drawn features Durla had felt were wasted on a man of his profession. Now any pleasing aspect was completely overshadowed by the scar that bisected his left eyelid and the smooth orb of carved jet that filled the socket. He angled his head at her, the edges of his mouth curling in something that approximated a sympathetic smile. "I heard about your recent troubles," he said, voice soft with sincerity. "A bad business, to be sure. What was her name?" "Livera," Durla replied. "Yes, Livera. Alpiran, as I recall. Very comely to the eye, was she not?" He reclined a little, the upper half of his face lost to shadow once more, speaking on without waiting for a response. "Beauty can be dangerous. Still, I'm given to understand the matter was swiftly resolved by your own dainty hand, no less. Sadly, the miscreant was taken from me, by a madwoman, so I'm told." One Eye's lips parted to release a fractional laugh. "Of course he was." He tapped the table with his thumb, indicating he didn't wish to exchange any cards. "Lord Muster?" Durla turned to her left. "Your bet, if you please." 2 golds. Muster tossed the coins into the pot. Durla noted how his puzzlement had transformed into one of his contemplative frowns, presumably as he pondered One Eye's words. "Seeing me clearly for the first time," she thought. "I wonder if he likes the view so much now." The Alpiran folded, turning his cards over with a careful lack of expression, followed immediately by the Nilsalin, leaving Muster and One Eye to contest the pot. "Stick." One Eye placed both hands flat on the table, leaning forward to cast a questioning glance at Muster. The Cumbralian's eyes continued to linger on Durla for a moment, before he switched his gaze to his opponent. He could raise the bet and force One Eye to either match it or fold. Either option might be taken as an insult by this singular king. It occurred to Durla for the first time that Muster might not fully understand who One Eye was. It seemed impossible that his forays into the seedier corners of Varensold had left him ignorant of the name, But did he truly understand the danger this man posed? Muster lowered his gaze to the revealed cards, brows bunching. Durla knew this to be for show. Drunk or sober, this man could calculate even the most complex odds in a matter of seconds. "Call me a poor sport, good sir," he said, offering One Eye an apologetic smile as he added another 2 golds to the pot. "But I believe a raise is in order." One Eye retreated fully into shadow once more, turning his cards over to reveal a hand with a collective value of less than 12 points. "Fold," he said. "You intimated to the good captain that luck was not a factor here. However, there was an equal chance that I held 3 of the noble suit, was there not?" "Actually, no." Muster flipped his cards, the Queen of Roses, the Prince of Snakes, and the Lord of Blades, plus 3 low-value cards from the minor suits. A moment's silence as the 2 mismatched glimmers blinked in the gloom. "How pleased I am to find your reputation isn't exaggerated, my lord," One Eye said, raising a hand and clicking his fingers. "Wine, I think." A trio of serving women appeared out of the shadows bearing bottles and goblets. From the swiftness of their arrival, it was clear they had been awaiting his summons. "A Cumbralian vintage, naturally," One Eye said as the women set a goblet down beside each player. "A subject on which I hear you're something of an expert, Lord Muster." "I have always felt a man should embrace his passions wholeheartedly," Muster said, nodding his thanks at the woman filling his goblet. When she set the bottle down and disappeared back into the gloom, he kept his hands clasped together, making no move to drink it. The other players were not so restrained, the Alpiran taking a small but appreciative sip, whilst the Nilsalin and the captain indulged in a generous gulp or 2. "Well," thought Durla as she strove to keep the dismay from her face, "at least the game will be shorter than expected." "A fine and commendable attitude," One Eye told Muster, lifting his own goblet. "And what is your wholehearted opinion of this offering, might I ask?" Durla's gaze locked with Muster's, and she gave a near imperceptible shake of her head. He forced a smile and began to reply, then stopped, as he saw something beyond Durla's shoulder. She didn't need to turn to see what it was, for she saw it beyond his shoulder, a slender blade gleaming in the shadows, one of several. Beside her, the Meldenian captain gave a short cough. "A moment, if you will," Muster said, lifting the goblet and raising it to his nose. "Levlin Vale," he said after a prolonged sniff, during which both the Alpiran and the Nilsalin had also begun to cough. "From southwestern Cumbrail, a lovely stretch of country, I should say." He sniffed again, then winced as the captain coughed once more, louder this time. The Meldenian put his hand to his mouth, and Durla saw a pinkish froth on his fingertips. "This is a 10-year-old vintage," Muster went on. "The grapes picked when their ripeness was peaking. A difficult thing to judge, so I'd say this comes from Lord Estes' holdings. Now there's a man who knows his trade." "All correct so far," One Eye conceded, sniffing his own goblet. "And the taste, my lord? Tell me, what secrets can you divine from the taste?" The captain, who had been staring at his pink-stained fingers, abruptly convulsed, doubling over with such force his forehead collided with the table. "Excuse me a moment," One Eye told Muster, turning to the now violently retching Meldenian. "By the way, Captain Alrath, I believe it's time we ended our association. Your decision to raise prices yet again was truly unfortunate. For you and your crew, not to mention your guests." The captain reared back, face crimson and eyes bulging as blood flowed thick from his shuddering lips. Beside Muster, the Alpiran surged to his feet, blood-stained gold teeth bared in a grimace as he drew a thin-bladed knife from the folds of his silks. Something flickered in the darkness behind him, and he arched his back, the knife dropping from spasming fingers as an inch of steel erupted from his throat. The odorous Nilsalin slumped forward, twitching as a crimson torrent streamed from his nose and mouth. "Your pardon, sir," Muster said, setting his goblet down with a poise Durla would have thought beyond him. "But I suspect the taste may be somewhat bitter. Chapter 11. One-Eye laughed, a strange melodious sound, rich in genuine humour. "Oh well," he said, laughter fading as he rose to his feet. "Trust a drunkard to spoil my fun." Captain Alrath roared, his reddened features devoid of all reason as he launched himself at One-Eye, hands latching onto his throat. Durla rolled free of her seat as the table went over, scattering coins and cards. She sank to all fours, scurrying away, glancing back just long enough to see the captain bear one eye to the deck, furious gibberish spouting from his mouth along with a bloody torrent as he tried to throttle his murderer. A flurry of blades flashed out of the gloom, and the captain stiffened, blood pouring from the numerous wounds in his back, but still held on, repeatedly slamming One-Eye's head to the boards. Durla tore her gaze away and crawled on. From the sound of it, the entire ship was in uproar, filled with a nightmarish cacophony of men and women screaming in pain or terror, clashing blades and splintered furniture, all punctured by the occasional snap and thud of a loosed crossbow bolt. It was dreadfully clear to her that One-Eye intended no witnesses to escape the night's events. She covered only a few yards before a hand reached down to snare the laces on the rear of her bodice, holding her in place. "Quo Shah sends his regards," a male voice informed her, the tone heavy with anticipation. Durla wasted no time by looking up at her assailant, jerking her head aside as the knife came down, leaving a small cut on her ear before sinking into the deckboards. She twisted her neck and clamped her teeth on the hand holding the knife, biting deep into the flesh behind the thumb. Blood flooded her mouth as the assailant voiced a high-pitched curse. She felt the grip loosen on her bodice and opened her mouth, releasing the hand and drawing her own knife from the small of her back. She lashed out at the attacker's legs, but he was quick, dancing clear so that the blade caught only an inch of boot leather. Durla rose to a crouch, raising her gaze to find the Stitcher staring down at her, clutching his maimed hand to his chest, thin face white with pain and fury. "I was just going to bleed you," he hissed. "Now I think I'll fuck you to death." The bottle exploded against the side of Stitcher's head in a dark blossom of wine and shattered glass. Despite appearances, Muster had a strong arm, and the outlaw dropped like a stone, lying senseless and still on the deck, save for the occasional twitch. But he wasn't still enough for Durla's liking. "My thanks, my lord," she said, sinking her knife into the base of the Stitcher's skull, drawing it clear and wiping the blade on his jerkin. "I think it's time we left, don't you? You best keep hold of that," she added, nodding to the jagged neck of the bottle still clutched in Muster's hand. She led him towards the stern of the ship, skipping over the dead and dying and dodging around the frenzied knots of combat. In the gloom, it was hard to make out the various factions. Meldenians and unaffiliated outlaws fought each other in their drunken confusion, whilst One-Eye's sober minions killed indiscriminately. Durla saw a man drag a bare-chested whore from her hiding place, and forced herself to turn away when he pulled the woman's head back by the hair, laying his dirk against her exposed cheek. Muster, it transpired, had more chivalrous instincts. He lunged forward, jabbing his broken bottle into the man's eyes and sending him screaming to his knees. The whore gaped up at her saviour for a few seconds, then scrambled to her feet and fled into the shadows, yelping like a startled dog. "Come on!" Durla grabbed Muster's hand and dragged him away. "No more heroics if you don't mind. I need to get you out of here unharmed." "On whose orders?" he asked. "You are here at someone's instruction, I assume." "A question you are more than capable of answering for yourself, I'm sure." Durla saw a figure loom up before them, dim light catching a short vertical gleam from the constricted arms of a steel crossbow. She shoved Muster against the bulkhead, displaced air caressing her cheek as the crossbow bolt buried itself in a beam 2 inches away. She whirled and charged the crossbowman. He had another bolt between his teeth, and the stock braced against his midriff as he drew back the string. His eyes widened at the speed of her attack, and he dropped the crossbow, reaching for the hatchet in his belt just as Durla's knife slashed across his throat. She left him drowning in his own blood, and beckoned urgently to Muster. "Here," she said, moving to an open porthole. Leaning out to survey the surrounding waters, she was relieved to find the encroaching cluster of boats undisturbed. It's a fair drop, but better than the alternative. Muster glanced at the porthole, staying still as he turned to her with a dark, distrustful gaze. "Who was Livera?" he demanded. "Is she the reason you latched yourself onto me?" "Do you want to fucking die here, you stupid drunken bastard?" He retreated a step at her shouting fury, blinking at the spittle landing on his face. "No," he said, wiping a finger across an eyelid. "I suppose I don't." "Good." She stepped back, nodding at the porthole. "After you, my lord." He grimaced and clambered into the opening where he hesitated. "That is quite the fall." Durla's foot slammed into Muster's posterior with sufficient force to send him on his way. She quickly clambered through the opening, launching herself clear with a hard shove of her legs. She had the ill luck to descend at the join between two boats, spraining her ankle on the timbers before plummeting into the sea. She sank quickly as the water soaked her dress. Light as it was, the additional weight was still enough to drag her down. Durla fought the water's pull, arms and legs flailing as she struggled to the surface, managing to get an arm clear before the water reasserted its grip. A hand caught hers just before it slipped back, gripping tight and pulling hard. Durla's head came free of the water as she found herself face to face with Muster. "I trust they're paying you well for all this," he said, reaching down to grip her beneath the shoulders and haul her into the boat. Durla allowed herself only a moment for the requisite gasping and retching before struggling to her feet. "There," she said, pointing to the boat they had left at the edge of the cluster a dozen yards away. They covered the intervening distance in a series of stumbling, frantic leaps, Durla taking hold of the oars whilst Muster cast off the lines. She pulled hard, Muster angling the tiller to aim the prow at the twinkling lamplight of the Varenshold quayside. They managed only a few yards before a hail of crossbow bolts descended into the surrounding water like steel rain. "It's a little rude to leave without at least thanking your host, don't you think?" a voice called from the ship. Durla lowered the oars, her gaze quickly finding One Eye standing on the rail of the Margentis's upper deck. A dozen men were arrayed on either side of him, all armed with crossbows. One Eye held something in his hand, something large and round that leaked dark fluid over the flanks of the Margentis as he swung it back and forth. "Captain Alrath is mightily offended, I must say." He raised the severed head level with his own, leaning close as if listening to a conspiratorial whisper. "Really?" he asked, turning back to Durla and Muster with brows raised in regretful surprise. "It seems a harsh punishment to me, but you are the captain." He tossed Alrath's head away, raising a dull thud as it landed somewhere amongst the encroaching boats. One Eye reached for a rope and launched himself from the rail, swinging out wide before letting go. He performed a perfect somersault, then landed on a boat at the edge of the cluster, accepting their non-existent applause with a modest bow. "Thank you. I have learned a great deal of new tricks recently, and I find I can't resist showing off." He straightened, all humour slipping from his blood-spattered face as he regarded them, features twitching a little. He didn't just lose an eye, Durla realized. He also lost his mind. "If you kill this man," she said, voice as steady as she could make it, pointing at Muster, "King Janus will tear the quarter apart to find you. His torturers will ensure your death lasts for days." One Eye smiled, though she noticed his twitch become momentarily more agitated. "At this moment, there is only one king that need concern you," he said in a strange voice that jarred on the ear. It sounded to her like a mix of accents all spoken at once. Surely another symptom of his madness. "Quo Shah has paid me well for your death," One Eye continued. "I was going to fulfill the contract later in the month, but fortunately you saw fit to make yourself so readily available on the very night I had arranged my coronation. As for him," One Eye turned to Muster, his face twitching with fresh energy, "he has to die." One Eye's voice trailed off, and the twitch abruptly faded. When he spoke again, the curious mix of accents was gone. "Not sure why exactly, but he does." He turned and began to raise a hand to the crossbowman on the ship. "Frentis!" Durla said. One Eye froze, then slowly lowered his hand. When he turned back to her, his entire face seemed to be twitching, the flesh bunching and lips curling almost as if it was trying to turn itself into something else. "Frentis," he said in his usual voice, slurred somewhat by the constant curl of his lips. "I know where he went," Durla said. She gripped the oars, raising the handles so the blades dipped into the water. "That buys your life," One Eye said, spittle now leaking from his lips. "Not his," he added, the mangled tones returning as he jerked his head at Muster. His body had begun to shudder now. It looked to Durla as if he were trying to contain something, perhaps clamp down on his madness long enough to learn what she knew. "Both of us," Durla said, giving a slow pull on the oars, drawing the boat away from the ship. "Or you may as well tell your men to loose those bolts, because if this man dies tonight, I'll cut my own throat before I'll tell you a thing." Another pull on the oars, One Eye's shuddering form receding further. "Self-sacrifice is not in a whore's nature," he said in his mangled voice. "I already died," Durla called back. She pulled the oars again, harder this time. "Where?" One Eye demanded, his normal tones now fully reasserted. Also, the shudder had disappeared from his body. "Tell me where. You know you can't hide in this city, not from me." Durla gave a full-strength pull on the oars, the boat slipping smoothly through the placid harbour waters. They weren't quite clear of the reach of the crossbows yet, but few archers could be sure of hitting the mark at such range. "The Sixth Order," she called back, her voice breaking and an unexpected wetness blurring her vision. She dragged air into her lungs and shouted it out. "He's with the Sixth Order. Good luck getting to him there, you mad fucker." She started rowing again, with furious energy now, pulling hard until the Margentis had shrunk back to a toad-like lump and One Eye was just a speck. She kept at it, chest, arms and legs burning from the effort, breath coming in ragged sobs. "I think you can stop now," Muster said, reaching out to grip her shoulders. "We're clear." Durla dragged the oars through the rowlocks, letting them fall from her hands. She sagged, borne down by exhaustion and a sick, fiery ball burning in her stomach. Guilt was an unfamiliar emotion. "You asked who Livera was?" she said in a murmur after the sobs had finally ended. "She was the woman I loved. I suspect the only soul in this world I'll ever love. She died, and so did I. The king took me into his service and I thought I might live again, carry the gift of her life with me like the catechisms say. But now I have betrayed her. You saved my life." Muster's hands cupped her chin, raising her face. He smiled, thumbing away her tears. "Albeit at the king's order. But that does not dim my gratitude. Nor will it ever, Durla. Whatever service you require of me, I'll give it. To the end of my days. I swear it by the 10 books and the Father's love." Durla sniffed, nodding and gently pushing his hand away. "We both appear to have become uncharacteristically devotional tonight, my lord," she said, reaching for the oars and angling the boat towards an open stretch of quay. The dockside was loud with the familiar chorus of drink, argument and lust that wouldn't fade until the smallest hours of the morning. She felt it to be as good a welcome as she deserved. "Do you know," Muster said, working his lips together, a frown of realization creasing his forehead, "I believe it's been more than a full day since I had a drink. An impressive achievement. Yes, but one never to be repeated if I have any say in the matter. I happen to know a wine cellar with an establishment close to the docks. He's been promising me something special for some time now. You're welcome to join me. Sadly, I must decline, my lord. I have a report to make." She turned her gaze to the dim bulk of the Margentis, hearing the faint, overlapping splashes of many bodies being consigned to the water, with one more to come. "And then," she added in a whisper, There's a spice merchant with whom I am keen to renew my acquaintance. Another time, then. Durla and Muster shared a faint smile as they sat in the boat. She wasn't sure if this was the ending or the beginning of something. It seemed entirely possible that Alveric might one day hand her a note ordering this man's death. More likely he'll hand someone else a note ordering mine. The notion stirred a flutter of fear in her breast, a fear she found herself holding to with sudden fierceness. She fed it with the horrors she had witnessed, this night and before, the sight of Livera's bleached, vacant face, and the empty eyes of the man who had killed her. The fear blossomed, burning with a heat that banished her guilt and brought a laugh to her lips. So I didn't die after all, she thought. You have to be alive to know fear. You've been listening to The Lady of Crows, a Raven Shadow novella, produced by Greg Lawrence. Executive producers James Tonn and Greg Lawrence. Text copyright 2017 by Anthony Ryan. Production copyright 2017 by Podium Publishing. All rights reserved. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, let us know. Take a quick moment to rate and review it on Audible so we know we're bringing you audiobooks you'll love.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.